All right, we'll go ahead and begin the program. This is Quilting for Beginners. This is a class intended for people who have thought about starting to get a quilt made or have a sewing machine that they've never used before. And we're very excited to share a little bit more about quilting with you. My name is Bryn Kiefer. I'm a librarian with Plano Public Library. And also presenting with me is Stephanie Tamayo, who will share a little bit about herself shortly. We also are joined by Zoe Francisco, who is going to help us with chat moderation. So if you have any questions, she will pass those along to myself and Stephanie. Before we do get started, we have some ground rules we need to let you know about. You will be muted during today's class, and we have your video blocked, so you will only see my screen. At the top of your screen, you can find an exit full screen option if you need to get to other things on your computer. You are welcome to ask questions or request that we repeat information at any time during the program. You should see an icon at the bottom of your screen that says chat. You can click on that to open the chat window, and the chat is set to be seen only by library staff. If you prefer, you may also use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that any inappropriate questions or comments will cause your immediate removal from today's class. For all questions, we may answer you directly in the chat or the Q&A box, hold the question until a break or the end of the class, or ask the question at the time if it is pressing. Let's see. And lastly, a recording of today's program will be available in a few days. So if you'd like to watch today's program again, that is also an option. All right, with that, let's go ahead and get started. As I shared previously, this is Quilting for Beginners. My name is Bryn Kiefer, a librarian with Plano Public Library, and presenting alongside me is Stephanie Tamayo. Today's agenda. First, we are going to cover a little bit about what quilting is and the history of quilting. Stephanie's going to share that portion. After that, we'll go into a little bit more of the logistics of quilting. We'll talk about necessary supplies you would need in order to start quilting, the quilting process itself, and then we'll offer up some ideas for activities for beginners. So activities that can help you get started without committing to a full-blown quilt, which can be a little bit of a daunting project. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Bryn. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to give a brief overview of quilting in general, starting with what quilting even is. So quilting is the process of sewing three quilt layers together using stitches in decorative pattern as motifs or in utilitarian patterns, such as straight lines with bigger stitches. And quilting is generally done by hand or by machine. Quilts definitely stimulate creativity because they can vary in complexity, as we can see in some of the pictures on this slide. So there's patchwork, which is when a quilt's top layer is made out of individual pieces of fabric with various designs that are then stitched together. An example of patchwork is the quilt seen here on the slide with the squares and rows down on the bottom left, Bryn's circling it. Quilts can also feature more complex designs like stars and shapes with challenging angles, like in the bottom right, to modern asymmetrical patterns on the top right. And we'll see later when we talk about, quilting throughout history, more modern designs like that. Quilting is an art form that can connect and pass along a family story, like in the top left picture with the family. It can also share talent with the community or simply keep you warm at night. Next, we'll talk about the history of quilting. Yes, so quilting came about for various ways, honestly. So obviously out of necessity, the concept of using padded fabrics for warmth and protection has existed since the Middle Ages or even earlier. And quilting was used for bedding, clothing, and even armor, like in the Crusades. There has been evidence of quilting found in ancient cultures across the world, for example, in Egypt, China, and Europe. Quilting frequently became integrated into other cultures as they interacted with each other. And obviously, sandwiching multiple layers of fabric together is very useful. Quilting also came about as a means for building community. In colonial and 19th century America, all quilting had to be done by hand, which was very time consuming. But to expedite the process and build community with neighbors and friends, women would gather in what were called quilting bees to work together on a single quilt. And this basically allowed women to create spaces for themselves. Quilting also allowed people to record their own experiences and their own history, right? Because history is bigger than just what can be found in the written tradition. So, for example, within enslaved communities in the Americas, enslaved women would use leftover textiles from garments and blankets they made for their enslavers to create quilts for themselves. This became an important form of expression and community as they would come together to share and preserve their experiences in stitches. And I actually wanted to give a quick shout out to the quilts of G's Bend because I just think they're really cool. So, G's Bend is also known as Boykin, and it's a predominantly Black community in Alabama. And many of the residents there are direct descendants of the enslaved people who worked the cotton plantation established there in 1816. The town of Gee's Bend is well known for its quilting tradition, with some of their quilts even ending up on exhibit or as permanent collections in museums across the US. I believe the Museum of Fine Art in Houston had an exhibit of these quilts. In 2006, the US Postal Service released a series of Quilts of Gee's Bend commemorative stamps. Quilting also allowed people to resist cultural assimilation. So, an example of this is in American Indian reservations and boarding schools, right? There was forced assimilation. So, sewing and quilting were used as strategic tools for cultural assimilation, especially with the Lakota Sioux of the Plains. However, many Indigenous artists at the time and even today continue using their own quilting techniques to create works of art that incorporate symbols and colors of personal and cultural significance, such as with the eight-pointed Sundance Star quilt, or there at the bottom, the red one. Um, Also known as the Morning Star. And these quilts were used in a variety of settings, including powwows on tribal council chambers, just to warm newborns, or to place on coffins during funerals. So that's the history of quilting, some of it. There's a lot more. But with contemporary quilting, on our next slide, obviously, the Industrial Revolution and globalization had a big impact on quilting. So, in the modern era, technological advances such as mechanized, then electric, then computerized sewing machines have changed the game for quilting. Similarly, our ability to obtain cheap fabric with vibrant colors has transformed the styles of quilts we're able to imagine. Quilts also became luxury goods. So, also because of the Industrial Revolution, basic blankets and mass produced fabrics have become significantly less expensive. And in comparison, a handmade quilt is a more personal, time consuming item, not a necessity. It's much cheaper to buy a polyester blanket or a factory produced woven blanket than to even buy the materials to make a quilt. And that's not even factoring the time and labor that's required to make a quilt now. There's also modern aesthetics. So while many people still make and buy quilts with more traditional blocks and patterns, modern aesthetics are incorporated freely into options as well. These quilts some of the tells for modern quilting, right? So they may use solid colors, asymmetry, like in that first slide we showed, straight lines, and blocks of color. And they sometimes even lack borders. So if it's so time consuming to make a quilt, and if it's so much cheaper to just obtain basic blankets, why even quilt in the first place, right? So plenty of reasons. It's a tactile activity. Art activities in general are a great way to retain motor function and engage mindfully with the world. It's it's the journey, right? Not the destination. There's also another good reason for sustainability. So, when done conscientiously, quilting allows for reuse of materials and selection of higher quality new materials that will last longer than mass produced blankets. And if you really wanted to, it could be an opportunity for you to make money. It could be an entrepreneurial endeavor if that interests you. Quilts are expensive and time consuming to make. So that means that just like fine art, you can probably get quite a bit of money out of making one. This isn't listed as a bullet, but obviously, gifts. They make great personalized gifts, and people are always really appreciative of handmade stuff. Not a quilt, but I made my friend um, a cross stitch, and it took like 3 weeks, and she was so pumped because it's like I was gifting her the cross stitch and also 3 weeks of my life, right? And then another good reason, community. So this hobby has a rich and growing community, and you can usually find fellow quilters wherever you are. Also, many quilters around the world are active on social media now, and they'll share their work and experiences and tips and tricks, and you can learn a lot from people online. Just like with the quilting bees we mentioned earlier, right? It's a great way to grow and build your community. And lastly, but probably most importantly, it's just fun. That's a great reason to quilt. So now I will hand it over to Bryn to talk about the actual quilt making process.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Here we go. So, next up, let's start by talking about the materials that you need to make a quilt. Because as you can imagine, you need the fabric, but you also need everything else that goes alongside the fabric. So, starting out, I want to talk a little bit about the pattern. But before we jump into that, let me go ahead and open the floor if there are any questions at this point in the presentation.
I'm not seeing anything right now. I think we're good to go.
All right, fantastic.
Oh,
So
we just
oh,
got one. Sorry.
aha.
Uh, Ashley asks, do you have to own a sewing machine?
Do you have to own a sewing machine? That is a very good question, and you do not have to own a sewing machine to quilt. We won't talk too much about it, but there are ways that you can hand quilt. Um, and it's going to look a lot like the traditional quilting methods because up until the 19th and 20th centuries, sewing machines were not attainable for most people in their homes. But we'll get into that in a moment. To start with, you'd need a pattern. So I recommend starting by choosing the pattern you want to make rather than going out to your local quilt store and buying the prettiest fabrics that you can see and just buying a ton of fabric. Not going to be super useful when you sit down with the pattern and you realize that it has very specific requirements for what your fabric needs are. That is what you can see here on the screen. This is one example of I believe this was a free pattern that is distributed. So it includes the specific fabric requirements necessary in order to make this particular design. It includes, looks like uh, fabrics A through M, which is about 12 fabrics, and has different yardage requirements for each of them. So something else to keep in mind as you are buying your fabrics using these requirements is that it's likely that you will make some mistakes. It's going to be the case for almost every single quilter, no matter level of experience. So you don't necessarily just want to get a single yard of fabric if that's the amount that it asks for. You want to at least get some extra so that you have space to make those mistakes without risking ruining your quilt. The quilt pattern also will specify the size of the quilt. Um, so there are standard ranges of sizes varying from queen size quilts all the way down to baby quilts and many, many others in between and even larger. Um, Queen size quilts, for instance, can range anywhere from 88 inches by 94 inches to 99 inches by 108 inches. So there aren't really specific standards, but there are ranges, just like there are with buying a blanket from the store. It will tell you generally what size bed it fits, but you might find that one fits a little bit better than others. Um, if you're just getting started with quilting, I recommend starting with a smaller size quilt. You don't want to pick the most complex design with many colors. You probably want to pick a quilt that uses 3 to 4 colors maximum. And most likely, you'll want to choose quilts that only really use 90-degree angles and maybe some 45-degree angles. So we're talking squares, rectangles, and triangles. Anything more advanced than that is going to start to involve some pretty complicated stitch work, and you don't want to frustrate yourself before you've even really had a chance to explore. Let's talk briefly about some terms to know. So when we're looking at patterns, you'll likely see the term block. So a block is a unit that is designed for a quilt. Most of the time, quilts have many blocks. They're usually going to be cut into the shape of a square or sometimes a rectangle. A quilt block can be a single piece of fabric that's cut with a rotary cutter into a square, or it can be pieced together using many pieces of fabric and then sewn together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So lots of terms there. Let's talk about a couple more of them. Piecing is the process where fabric pieces are sewn together to form a block, a garment, or a quilt. So if you have 2 squares of fabric and you put them together in a little sandwich, and then you stitch along one side of that sandwich, you have pieced those together because theoretically now you can open them up and see both of them side by side connected. When we talk about seam allowance, that is the fabric between the sewing line and the raw edge of the fabric. So if we're talking about our little quilt, our little fabric sandwich that we've stitched along a line, the seam allowance is going to be that space right before the actual edge of the fabric. And with quilting, because it tends to be an extremely mathematical process, the seam allowance is 1/4 inch, at least if we are using American imperial measurements. I could not tell you what it is in metric, but for all intents and purposes, if you are using imperial measurements, it's going to be 1/4 inch for quilts. And last but not least, you'll occasionally see, I don't see any examples on these particular patterns. You'll tend to find a lot of acronyms that may not mean anything to you at first. If you see the acronym WOF, that means width of fabric. So oftentimes a pattern will tell you to cut um, 3 inches WOF. That means it wants a strip of fabric that is 3 inches wide and is as long as the piece of fabric is wide. So that would typically be, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, about 42 to 44 inches. Speaking of which, fabric. So this is another necessity that you need for quilting. In some cases, it's actually more of a necessity than the pattern because, as you can imagine, sometimes you'll get familiar with a particular style of quilting and you won't necessarily need to follow a pattern, but you will need fabric to do whatever it is you're going to do. So when we talk about fabric for quilting, we are usually talking about quilt weight cotton. So most quilt fabric, at least fabric that is intended to be used for quilting, is either cotton, a blend, or in some cases, it is flannel or canvas. Excuse me. Standard quilt cotton comes in rolls that are 42 to 44 inches wide, like I said, and in most stores, especially quilting stores, this is sold by yardage. So you will take your bolt of fabric up to the counter and ask them to cut a yard or a half a yard or any number of yards that you specify. It will be custom cut. In some instances, you can also find fabric being sold in small groupings as pre-cuts, often distributed by the manufacturer um, in that form so that you can get more different styles of fabric in like a bundle. So you'll see a bundle of like 40 different styles and colors of fabric that all go together. If you are starting out as a quilter, you really want to buy what you need. As tempting as it is to go out and buy all the beautiful fabric that you see, um, you really don't want to do that when you're just starting out because that can get extremely expensive fast, and inevitably you won't have all the fabrics you'll need. So you'll have to go buy more. Um, Follow the patterns requirements like we were talking about, and um, then when you're a little bit more experienced and know your speed of quilting and how much you're going to use, that's when you can start to accumulate what's called a stash. So when you buy fabric without a project in mind, that's going to be known as your stash. And again, for reasons of sustainability and wanting to use what you have without holding on to it for ages and ages, it's best to look at your stash first when you are choosing a new pattern. That way you can identify if you already have fabric to use for that quilt and limit what you need to actually go out and purchase. Also, talking a little bit more about fabric in this way, you also, as part of your quilt, will need batting and backing. So, backing is the standard quilt fabric that is used on the reverse side of the quilt. You can either buy it as regular fabric and then piece it together, so put it together to make the full size of the back of the quilt, or you can occasionally find what's called wide back fabric, which is the it's going to be it's wider fabric is what it is. So you can buy it at especially quilt stores sell it. It doesn't usually come in as many patterns, but it's also the side that's not typically visible. So in many cases, it's more simple to buy wide back fabric and not have to worry about piecing together a second side of your quilt. Additionally, batting is the fabric in the interior of the quilt. So if we're calling it a quilt sandwich, which you'll sometimes hear, the backing and the quilt top are the bread and the batting is the interior. So this is going to be the material that varies depending on how warm you want to make your quilt. You can get batting that is extremely warm and thick. Wool batting tends to have that quality. You can also get extremely lightweight batting if you live or you're using, say, a quilt as a summer cover. You don't necessarily want something super warm. In some cases, you can even choose to use lighter weight fabric than batting as the interior of the quilt. Additional terms to know, um, batting, we talked a little bit about that just now. Um, it's also used for um, quilted clothing and home decor. So it's something that can give an element of texture to many different sewn and woven goods. It generally is made from cotton, a cotton polyester blend, bamboo, wool, or a bamboo cotton blend. So you can find a lot of different varieties out there. Additionally, there are some different terms you'll see for what's we said was pre-cut fabric. So you'll see something called fat quarters, which is going to be a quarter of a yard of fabric, but not cut in a long strip. It's essentially the fabric cut in half one way and then cut in half the other way. So essentially cut hamburger style, if you've heard that in schools, as opposed to hot dog style. Um, you'll see terms like jelly roll, which is a bunch of lengths of, um, if I'm remembering right, I believe it's 2.5 inch wide strips of fabric. Layer cakes, charm packs, these are all different, essentially marketing terms for these uh, premium cost, but very pretty and fun to look at packs of pre-cut fabric. Before we move on to sewing machines, are there any questions about fabric or patterns? It seems like there may not be. So we'll continue. As I shared, if you have questions, feel free to ask them at any time, and I'll be happy to circle back. All right, let's talk about sewing machines. So we aren't going to get, before I get into anything at all, we aren't going to get into different brands and different preferences because that is a conversation that is far above my ability to share in an hour and a half. Um, the simple truth of it is there are options for quilting at any price point. You probably have seen that they sell sewing machines at places like Walmart and Target for a couple $100s. Um, the most expensive sewing machines can be more expensive than a car, several $1,000s. Um, depending on how much you want to spend, you can find something that will do the job. Um, and you'll also do want to consider how much space you have, as some of those machines, especially the several $1,000 quilting sewing machines, are going to be extremely large. So, the uses for sewing machines. When you are in the process of making a quilt, you will have two main functions for your sewing machine. The first is the piecing and assembling process, where you're attaching two pieces of fabric together at a joining point, and then the quilting process. The piecing and assembling process typically only requires a standard straight stitch, so almost any sewing machine can do that part of it. The ability to quilt on a machine is a little bit more complicated. And here's why. It's because depending on the style that you want to use, you may need extra attachments. If you are trying, depending on if you're trying to use a long arm technique, that's a process that does require one of those several $1,000s machines. Um, so some terms to know, we have long arm sewing machine, which is a type of specialty sewing machine. This is the expensive one. It's typically computerized and it has more space in the throat, which if you look at the screen is this area right here. So that's the throat. As you can imagine, the bigger that area is, the more quilt fabric you can stuff in there as you're trying to get the center of your quilt sewn. Um, it also often comes with a scrolling rack that is used to control the quilt while you're actually quilting. Um, in a lot of cases, one of the reasons why someone would want to get a super expensive long arm quilting machine is because it is computerized and can automatically follow a preset pattern. So that can really increase the speed of quilting, which might be ideal if you are trying to do a lot of quilts quickly, like you're running a business, if you're pursuing that as an entrepreneurial opportunity. Um, if that doesn't seem like an option for you, and for most people it's not, it's also worth noting that you can quilt on a regular sewing machine. This is a process called free motion quilting. This requires a what's called a darning foot or a hopping foot. Uh, without getting too into technical terms regarding how to use a sewing machine, um, the feed dogs, which move fabric through the sewing machine, if you drop those, then you can move the quilt around underneath the needle as you sew and create patterns. If you go this route, there are lots of resources online to learn how to do it. We'll look a little bit more about that during the process portion. Um, it can be challenging, and I recommend practicing first. Another term to note is the foot or the presser foot. So this is the attachment that you'll find right around the needle, and it can be swapped out. Your A lot of the more basic machines come by default with just the one presser foot, but more advanced sewing machines will come with additional ones that you can swap out for different purposes. Um, and you can buy sets of them for many of the sewing machines that don't include them. Common presser feet for quilting include the 1/4 inch foot, which lets you easily find your seam allowance, and the darning foot, which lets you free motion quilt. And lastly, as we discussed previously, you can quilt by hand. It is possible to quilt using hand stitches, both the piecing portion of the process and the quilting portion. Um, as you can imagine, this tends to take a lot longer than quilting on a machine, but you gain personalization and control over your final result. So this can also be a good mindfulness activity if you're looking for something to do with your hands. The end results are really special and delightful. All right, notions. We've got notions for all kinds of things. So the term notion means uh, just refers to small tools and materials used in sewing and quilting. So basically everything else. So a very broad term. So we're going to cover a lot of different groups of notions. So notions for measuring, cutting, and pressing. These are really important for helping to ensure your fabric is the right size. Before we get into specifics, I do want to note that a lot of notions are very much optional. If you're quilting on a budget, you don't need to go out and, excuse me, buy all of these things today or tomorrow. A lot of them you can find substitutes for that work perfectly well. Um, you can always accumulate them as time goes on and you realize, hey, this ruler from my kid's backpack isn't really doing the trick after all. I think I should get an acrylic ruler. So consider what you need right away. Most of these things are not going to fall into that category. They are going to be things to add to your collection over time. So acrylic rulers are a really good tool when it comes to the early process of quilting. And learning how to quilt, you're going to be cutting a lot of straight lines and learning to cut exact angles, creating perfect rectangles. Um, See-through rulers with the 1/4 inch marks, you can see those here. Uh, if they have 1/4 inch marks that you can easily line up with your fabric, then that is a really handy tool to have. Um, you can do this rapidly and it will really speed up your process. Sewing scissors. So as opposed to just using kitchen scissors or scissors that are used to cut paper, these scissors are specifically designed to cut fabric. And you do not want to use them for other things besides fabric because it will dull them over time. Um, Specialty scissors like this are extremely useful and create extremely precise lines for cutting, which helps in most aspects of the quilting process. I also really like to use rotary blades for straight lines myself. You can see some of those up here in this picture. If you have what's called a self-healing mat, which we'll talk about in a second, you can essentially use it like a pizza slicer. So you cut along the ruler and get a perfectly straight line, and it really speeds up the process. Self-healing mats, you might know these from using X-Acto knives as well. If you put this under your cutting surface and your rotary blade to protect your table, it will protect your surface and prevent the blade or the scissors from damaging your furniture. Lastly, you might find an iron to be very helpful during the process. You can Either use a full-size iron or a smaller iron to press down on seams to create crisp lines and connective points between fabric. Notions for attaching. So, thread. This is something you need. You want to get high quality quilting thread for this purpose. Some threads seem deceptively pretty or shiny, and when you actually go to use them, you'll find that they stretch out or they break easily. And you really want quilting thread to be strong and durable, as ideally these quilts will get a lot of use, and um, that you don't want to have to repair them as often as you might if the thread is just breaking all the time. If you use different colors, you can find that that adds to the design in intriguing ways. So if you have a quilt that's primarily, let's say, um, greens and browns, you could use potentially a light colored brown thread like this one here to blend in with the fabric, or you could use a much brighter green to announce itself and enunciate. So you can use that as a creative element as well. Pins, so we have here a pin cushion with many pins in it. These can help hold quilt pieces in place temporarily. I recommend having some on hand so that you can do that and hold pieces together before you sew them. Basting spray. This is one that is nice to have, but not fully necessary. Basting spray is essentially an adhesive, a temporary adhesive, so that when you are putting the different pieces of the quilt, so the batting and then the backing and the top of the quilt together, it all stays in place until you actually have stitches into it. Um, and then once you are finished, it washes out in the laundry. It's very handy to use, but it's not strictly necessary. Additionally, there is something called adhesive fusible web. So if you get into what's called applique designs, which are essentially adhered on top of other fabric, so layered fabric to create almost a collage, um, these can help you to um, attach things together in a permanent way. You can iron them onto your design and then iron it to the quilt and it will fuse it together, thus fusible web. Lastly, notions for marking. I highly recommend having a water-soluble marker on hand. These marks with a water-soluble marker will remain on fabric until water is added. So if you need to keep track of where a line needs to be on your quilt, where you need to cut, where you need to where the sew line is, where the seam is going to be. That is something you can easily add to it and then know that just spraying it with some water will get rid of it when you're done. There are also air-soluble markers. These are really good for markings that you're using immediately and won't need afterwards because they fade almost right away. Um, a Hera blade. So this little white tool over here is called a Hera blade. This allows you to create scoring in the fabric. I personally have not had that much luck using those as I find it hard to see. Um, but I've heard good things about it from some other people. So if marking it with a water-soluble marker doesn't work for you, you might look into that as a potential option. And of course, chalk. Chalk is the original traditional option for marking, especially on dark fabric surfaces. So if you're working with really dark fabrics, that might be the way to go because a marker is not going to show up, and chalk will. All right, we're about to move into making a quilt, but before we do so, are there any questions about supplies you might need? I know this has been a lot of information so far.
Not as of yet.
All right. Let's talk about the process of making a quilt. So first things first, you'll want to gather supplies. Um, Depending on the process you're following, you'll probably want to start by choosing a quilt pattern. So selecting your quilt pattern first will give you the guidelines that you need to know exactly what to expect and how much fabric you'll need, as well as make determinations about what color thread to use, and start thinking about how you want to quilt the final product. Once you've chosen your quilt pattern, you can then go and purchase fabric for the quilt top, the thread, the batting, the backing, and you'll know exactly how much yardage the pattern calls for. Um, one thing to keep in mind, um, even if the pattern itself calls for certain colors or styles of fabrics, you don't have to necessarily follow that. You can choose your own adventure, so to speak, and select fabrics that may not be what is originally called for in the pattern you're using. You can change the color scheme entirely. You do want to choose high quality materials as much as you are able, if you are able to. Um, High quality quilting fabric tends to last longer and has a higher thread count, usually at least 60 threads per square inch, and is smoother and softer to the touch. So it will create a much higher quality product. That said, if that's not an option, you can explore any number of other things, including thrifted fabrics, um, clothes that don't fit you anymore, hand-me-downs, even other blankets and sheets can be really good options for, especially if you're just starting out, um, and you just want to try the process. Next, you will need to begin cutting your fabric. Like when you are talking about construction and woodwork, the old adage of measure twice and cut once remains true. I am guilty myself of having measured once and then had to cut twice because the piece of fabric I ended up with was too thin, and um, either that or had to radically change the pattern just to make sure that I had enough fabric for everything. Um, Precision definitely makes the difference. Um, Not just in terms of making sure you have the right size, but making sure that the lines and the angles are correct. Um, when it comes to right angles, you want to make sure that they are exactly 90 degrees to the best of your ability. Even a little bit of difference there can impact the final product, or at least make your life much more difficult when you're trying to make everything connect. Um, let's see, interpreting pattern instructions. Sometimes this can be one of the harder parts of the process. A lot of patterns don't clearly explain how many of the certain pieces you'll need, and different patterns specify things differently. There's not a standard publication style guide that quilt pattern makers are referencing. So one quilt maker might say one thing, and then another might say the same thing differently. And you really have to kind of look through the whole thing to figure out what they mean and what you're going to need. One example, so some might tell you that you need 32 of a certain cut, but then add a note that you'll need to cut the pieces in half diagonally later. So read through the whole pattern. If you cut too few, you can always go back and cut more later. But if you cut too many, then you can't uncut that, um, at least not without extreme difficulty sewing things back together and whatnot. And if you make too many of something, then chances are that fabric needed to be used somewhere else. Determining your workflow, this is going to vary a lot depending on what suits you. Some people prefer to cut all of the fabric at the beginning of their project. Others might prefer to do one block at a time. It might depend on the type of project. Um, I tend to go back and forth, and I don't tend to settle on a workflow. So it's going to vary a lot. You'll have to find what works best for you if this is something you're pursuing. All right, the next portion is piecing the quilt. So this, like we said, is the process of combining all the small cut up pieces of fabric into one large section. Um, you'll be using the piecing process to create blocks. So individual pieces of fabric are combined into essentially larger sections of fabric that still aren't the whole quilt usually. Here is an example in this picture on the right side of some quilt blocks. So as you can see, there are multiple fabrics sewn together for each quilt block, but by itself, it still is not a full quilt cover. Um, Once you have blocks, you then sew those together. Typically, the idea with blocks is that then you only have to sew the blocks in straight lines as opposed to trying to figure out different angles and whatnot. Um, this is where the precise measurements for your cutting will really pay off. If everything is the right size, and you can see here that this person did an exceptional job of attaching things at exactly the right spot, and everything looks like it's the right width and the right dimensions, that precision will allow you to ensure that the final quilt is a lot easier to put together, because these edges here in particular, if it's not the right size, there will be some variation in where the edge of the fabric is. But when things come together perfectly, that final seam that you sew will be that much smoother and easier to manage. As you go, you will need an iron most likely to press your seams. So the seams being these little spaces here, you can kind of see the seam allowance underneath that's been pressed. So if you press it flat, then that means that the fabric will sew to other pieces of fabric easier. Um, Assembling blocks. So once you have your blocks, you'll assemble them like piecing. Some patterns include what is called sashing or borders. So sashing is going to be spaces between blocks. So on this edge outline here is going to be sashing. And then the border would be the edge of the quilt between the the outermost blocks and the actual binding of the quilt. These can create both visible and um, aesthetic space to admire the art of the quilt, while also helping to kind of standardize how things look, and keep it from being too busy appearing. The final result is essentially one solid fabric. So you can see here, this person is unrolling what looks like a relatively complicated quilt top. Though it is possible that that is one piece of fabric, it looks like they have sewn it together, um, with all of the different colors being different fabrics originally. And they are preparing to go into the next phase of the process, which is quilting. Although this is the intermediate step, which is basting. This is where that basting spray I mentioned comes in handy. They have layered first the back of the quilt, then they probably sprayed basting spray or basted it in a more traditional way by using some loose stitching to attach the backing to the batting. And now they are attaching the quilt top to the batting as well. So more or less, once they are done with this, the quilt will have been fully, almost fully assembled and ready for quilting, which when we talk about quilting as part of the quilting process, we are talking about this. We are talking about the thread that is connecting and going through all the layers of fabric to attach them, but also to create the final designs. Quilting by hand, you definitely can do this. It is the most personal option and also most likely the cheapest. You don't need a sewing machine for this. You just need thread and needle and a lot of patience. It's going to be time consuming if this is the route you go. Um, you also will probably want to accept that the final result is not going to have this level of perfection that you see in a lot of the machine quilted quilts, or especially the long arm quilts, because those often are computerized. Um, that imperfection is what makes it so beautiful as an art form, because it adds a level of whimsy and delight and really demonstrates for whoever is the recipient, whether by gift or um, by sale, that this is a product created, an item, an art piece created with love. Machine quilting, so we've talked a little bit about this, but here we can see an example of how that actually looks. You can see that the person here has, we lost it, there we go. They are sewing with their sewing machine. They have a darning foot on it, and they are physically moving the quilt underneath the needle. Um, the final result looks something like this picture over here. There are many, many different patterns you can follow with free motion quilting. But effectively, as long as it is continuous line and you have the patience and arm strength necessary to follow this pattern continuously and without uh, without shaking too much. It is a physically daunting process, but the final result is really exciting to look at. Unlike with long arm quilted quilts, you can really get into specific details. So you can choose to use one design for one area of a quilt and do something completely different somewhere else. You can also do that with hand quilting. Um, but for me, machine quilting, I find it to be kind of the best of both worlds. Long arm quilting is going to be out of the question for most people to personally do because, as mentioned, long arm quilting machines are thousands of dollars. That's beyond the range of most people's financial means. However, there are ways to access long arm quilting services without um, actually buying a machine. Um, you can essentially pay someone to long arm it for you. There are businesses throughout the local area as well as across the country, worldwide, that complete long arm quilting for people. Often you will pay for it by square inch or something like that. It can get expensive. There are also services at quilt stores where you can rent out a long arm machine. So it really depends on the options available near you. So if that's something you want to consider, I would ask around and perhaps make some phone calls to find out what options you have. Um, there also, occasionally, you'll find a long arm quilting machine in a maker space or even in a library. Unfortunately, we do not have one, but there may be some local libraries that would be able to offer you access to one potentially for free. All right. Lastly, the final step of making a quilt is the binding process. So you're almost done. Once you've quilted your whole quilt and you're ready to finish it up, you essentially add a bound edge to the quilt, ideally without being any of them being visible. If you are stitching by hand, there are ways to do this with literally none of the edge stitching being visible. Personally, I do not have the patience for that. Um, so you can sew it the same as the rest, or there's a few different styles you can do. And The last step beyond that is to make sure to label your quilt. So if you've taken the time to hand make a quilt, you should consider adding a quilt level or quilt label, excuse me, to tell people when it was made, who made it, and possibly a little bit more information about your work, such as the occasion. For instance, if it was the birth of a relative, that might be an exciting thing to include somewhere on the quilt so that they can remember that as they look back on it. All right. Before we move on to some possible beginner quilt activities, are there any questions about the quilting process or anything so far? All right. It seems like we do not have any questions, so we'll go ahead and continue on to some beginner quilt activities to try. These are, like was saying, some good options if you've never quilted before, are just curious about it and want to try it out without, buying a bunch of fabric, buying a sewing machine if you don't already have one, spending hours upon hours making a quilt. These are some miniature activities. So, literally, in this case, making a miniature quilt is an option. You can use old clothes or scraps of fabric to make a single quilt block and then quilt and bind it like you would a full quilt. Good for trying out the quilting process without a ton of investment. Um, as you can see, this person has made a fairly decent sized miniature quilt. I actually made a couple of those when I was trying out free motion quilting and trying to figure out how that even works. And then they ended up essentially on my couch as little cat quilts. Um, and now I think they're somewhere under the couch, completely covered in cat fur. But they were loved for the time that they were in use. Um, you can, like I said, use these mini quilts to practice free motion quilting. They also make fun gifts, so you can gift them to your pets. You could use something like this as a placemat or a not a tablecloth, but a little table display. You could even potentially hang something like that on the wall as wall art. Something else to look at doing is coloring a quilt pattern. So you can find quilt patterns that are not colored in for free online. Some different quilt companies will release the raw outlines of their quilt pattern so that you can try out different fabrics and decide what looks best to you. Um, in this case, I decided to color these two different, well, the same quilt pattern in with two different styles to show that these decisions can really change how they look. So you see that the one on the left has kind of a reflection uh, duality. It's very vibrant. It's got a lot of contrast between the blue section and the orange section versus the one on the right, which is a lot more subdued and uses a lot of uh, blues and green tones that really make it kind of blend together. It's a lot more relaxing. It also emphasizes different elements of the lines. Something to note about this, of course, is that depending on how many different fabrics you end up using, that may impact fabric requirements if you were to decide to make these quilts. Another option, you can try exploring a foundation paper piecing style with collage work. So foundation piecing or paper piecing, it's an aspect of quilting that we didn't really talk about yet. Essentially, it uses fabric-like mosaic tiles to form an image that is not just geometric or abstract, but actually creates imagery with the fabric. So you can see some different examples here. These two are paper pieced, but they are still geometric. They're a lot more precise and detailed than the kinds of quilt designs you see traditionally. And then down here, we have some examples of these abstract or these tiled forms that are literally creating images. Um, it's just creating different pieces of fabric that connect to others and form animal faces. Um, you can try this out without fabric. So that's what we're getting at with this activity. You can essentially use straight lines to create a design like this. Maybe start out something less intimidating because I don't think I could create these on my first or 50th try. But try drawing some straight lines and seeing if you're able to make something that looks like something and then color it in. And then you can practice cutting out pieces of paper to match up with those lines and experiment with what works, what doesn't work, and connect paper piecing with literal paper piecing And you have two art forms right there that you're combining. All right, before we wrap up the program for tonight, I did want to share some free resources for quilting that you can find online. Um, First of all, it's worth noting that there are many quilt block libraries online. I included just two links here, um, which are to Generations Quilt Patterns and quiltstreet.com. Both of these are examples of free public domain quilt block libraries. So, like many forms of art, quilt blocks do at some point enter the public domain. So, traditional quilt blocks that you'll hear referenced often have most often entered the public domain, which means anyone can use them in their designs without having to accredit a particular person. These are great options for just learning how to quilt because um, they're tried and true. There's um, ample resources for learning how to make them, and they've stuck around for generations because they look good. So, worth exploring and seeing what you might be able to make with those. Um, I also included a link to the Free Motion project, which let's actually click through to a couple of these. So, first of all, oh, it's not going to let me go through. Mm. Stephanie or Zoe, can you confirm that you're able to see the internet?
I'm seeing your slide.
Okay, so we will revert back to just going on the slide deck because it doesn't seem like that's working, unfortunately. Um, but the Free Motion Quilting Project has dozens, I think it has hundreds at this point of different free motion quilt designs that you can use with your sewing machine. So you can look through them, you can try out different things. Some of them are extremely complicated, some are a lot more basic, but it's really cool to see all the different things that people have put together. And lastly, with your library card, you can access Press Reader, which is our resource for magazines and newspapers. There are numerous quilting magazines and publications that you can access for free with your library card, including Quilter's World, Today's Quilter, and Quilter's Companion. So if you're curious about the kinds of information and techniques shared within those resources, they're free for you to check out with your library card. All right. If you have any last questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat now, and we will open the floor for them in a moment. But while you are typing those up, I did want to share some upcoming programs that might be of interest. This Sunday at 2 p.m., we have Adinkra Stamps at Harrington Library. This is a very exciting program where you'll actually create stamps in a traditional style. And this program is ticketed, so you'll want to get there 30 minutes before so that you can get a free ticket. And additionally, we have our Sit and Stitch program at Haggard Library. The next one is going to be Monday, February 10th from 7 to 8 p.m. But we host those regularly every other Monday. So if you can't make this coming one, uh, we'll have future opportunities. It is a really, really cool group that gets together and does any number of fiber art activities. So a lot of people bring their knitting and crocheting. Some people bring embroidery and cross stitch. But you could be the first person to bring quilting and hand quilt right there in the library for everyone to admire. All right. As we are gearing up to answer any additional questions, here is our contact information. I am Bryn. I am a public services librarian, and you can reach out to me by email if you have any additional questions, either immediately after the program or later on. And Stephanie's contact information is there as well. All right. Do we have any questions in the chat?
Somebody wants to know the age group for sit and stitch.
For Sit and Stitch, Let me confirm, but I believe that is going to be for adults.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah,
It's for adults.
good question. Any others?
That's all I'm seeing. I think on our YouTube channel we had a sit and stitch, um, was it like Get Ready With Me with one of our staff members who hosts it. So if you guys want to look on our
Oh,
YouTube page and kind of get an idea.
that's very exciting.
Somebody else said, is this program recorded on YouTube? It will be uploaded in a couple of days. Not sure how many days, but yeah, we upload our webinars onto our YouTube page. Thank you guys for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much for attending. We'll stick around for another couple of minutes here in case there are other questions. Um, but other than that, we will hopefully see you at future library programs. And I hope you enjoy your quilting journey if you decide to go on it.
Someone said, do you have the bookmarks for the Quilters Guild of Plano? I'm not sure.
I don't believe we do. We don't typically carry community resources of that nature these days. That might be something that they could share at Sit and Stitch, though. So if that's an option to bring to one of those meetings. All right, I think everyone is slowly filing out, so we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you once again for attending, and we will see you next time.